Let's jump in. Last few weeks I've been talking about goal setting, and I'm going to stick with goal setting not because it's the best one to use, but it's the most universally understood. Everyone's had some experience with it. Certainly coaches, consultants, etc. clearly understand. What I'm going to do is use that and then map neuroplasticity back to it. There are other things I can use to map neuroplasticity, and we'll do those in the roundtable discussions when we're actually having conversations with people. So let's take a look, and we're going to first, most people have seen this, specific, measurable, and I put ambitious. It's normally aggressive, realistic, and time-bound. Fun fact is I was in a room in Waco, Texas, and I was working with I was a distributor for Success Motivation Institute, and I was with a few other distributors, and we had come up with this SMRT, and we were trying to figure out the A. And that was in 1980. And we were all around ambitious or aggressive, and we kept getting hung up on the realistic and aggressive and attainable. It was just a lot of different iterations that we were having in that room, and we all walked away with sort of a version that we were going to use. I didn't see it again until 1995. But the point is, it's been around for a long time, and so it works, and people have used it. But there's a lot of distinctions. I'm not going to get into it today, but this, for example, works. It's more effective in an operational environment than it is in a strategic environment. And the reason is because strategic has more unknowns, and even more and more now. I mean, we have to make, the more assumptions you have to make in terms of the outcome, the less this is going to apply. Because when you're making assumptions, it makes it harder to be specific and measurable. And the reason I'm using ambitious instead of aggressive is specifically for the conversation around mapping it to neuroplasticity. Normally I would use aggressive and realistic. Sometimes I use relevant, but I think specific, measurable, aggressive, realistic, time-bound is pretty universal. I've seen that quite often. I do see relevant and I do see attainable, but the bottom line is there's multiple dimensions, and these 5 capture it. The other thing I want to add on to that is the definition of success, and I've used this definition for almost 50 years. The progressive realization of predetermined, worthwhile personal goals. It stands up against everything, and this is why with neuroplasticity, before I start working with the client, I have to be able to map their quest to their purpose. Now, it doesn't have to be 100%. It could be a 10% if you think about a Venn diagram. But I have to tie it into the purpose, because the inner work that's necessary to achieve a stretch goal is too much for casual interests, too much for casual benefits. We've got to go to the purpose and the vision, and even if there's only a 10% overlap, as long as I can tap it to that, because on bad days or bad weeks, I have to have something, some context for the person to keep going. And the point is, they pay for the service, right? And that's a good start. But in order to live into that, I need something that's bigger than themselves. And on bad days or bad weeks, we need that. And fortunately, every day, every week is not bad, right? It's just when those times come up. And often those times come up because it's right before breakthrough. Breakthroughs are preceded by confusion. And there's a lot of cognitive dissonance as we approach that moving above the line. And that's because of the going against what we believe. We believe that this is the way it is, or we believe it's not available to us. I can't do it. It's not for me. I've tried it many times. Nothing works. Those are beliefs, whether you think of them as beliefs or not. If you've said it enough, it's turned into a belief. Why? Because the network of neurons, right? The neurons that wire together fire together, and the ones that fire together wire together. So if you're saying it over and over, it's acting like a belief. And that's part of what we can do with neuroplasticity is identify. Neuroplasticity doesn't identify the beliefs, but once we identify the limiting beliefs, I use another process for that, then we can change those beliefs. And I'll tie that back into that when we get towards the end. So we have the specific, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound. I used ambitious because I wanted to tap into the purpose. That was the point about that. So now I've looked at this many different ways, and it's still under construction, but this is a good view of where I am so far. We have the practical and behavioral on this side. So if you think of this as a continuum, and one of the reasons why I started this work is because having been trained in Rangers and as an Army Ranger and training with Navy SEALs and going after many goals, I mean hang gliding and skydiving and motorcycle racing, car racing, teaching. I was a performance driving instructor for the Porsche Club in Chicago. So I mean, I was teaching people how to drive at the margin, and you learn a lot. And then plus building multiple high performing teams over a 15-year period using these same principles. Now at the time, we weren't using the terminology of neuroplasticity, but it was in the under the umbrella of neuroscience, and there were things that were proven. So the short version is that I've been using principle-based, science-backed tools, but there was always a gap, and that gap existed until neuroplasticity. And where I connected the dots was when I was working on figuring out how to mitigate the impact of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases seemed to be, at the time, this is a few years ago, one of the major resistance factors that occur on the way to success. And so I said, if I could figure out a way to mitigate the cognitive biases, that's removing resistance and then a person's success. And that's basically the approach I've used in this first principles thinking. So on the one, and then the last part is that over here on the practical and behavioral, this is where executives and leaders live. You don't bring in metaphysical stuff into the C-suite. You're not going to talk to the board about, yeah, we're going to do this, this, and this, and then we're going to hope real hard. I'm being facetious, but using manifestation language is how we're going to get it. It's not going to float, because investors know that they need more practical and they need things that actually work. So that back to the first principles thinking. And what I've done is remove the assumptions that have to occur in order to use quantum or metaphysical. I wanted it to be as pure over here. A equals this, B equals that, C equals the other. And I wanted it to be that clean. And I'm pretty close to closing that whole range. So on this side, we have hard and smart work. Over this side, and I'm using law of attraction as a placeholder. Call it law of attraction adjacent, whether it's manifestation, energetics, vibration, abundance, gratitude. There's a lot of things that go into law of attraction, but it's not all law of attraction. And keep in mind, while law of attraction got a really big boost in the 80s, it's been around since the 1890s. And there was a big resurgence. But back in the late 1800s, from 1850 to about 1940 or so, the New Thought era, there was a ton of, you have books like Science of Getting Rich by Wallace Wattles, The Game of Life by Shin, you've got William James, called the father of psychology. So all of that was happening during this time, and it was expanded because the printing press was just was able to crank out all of this content, and so philosophers from around the world were getting to see other people's work, and it just exploded. Now, there are a lot of beliefs that we use today that came from that period. So on the left side, and I don't think anyone would disagree with this, we have the strategy, leverage, process, systematic or systemic, physical, design, right? Design, build, implement, test, follow up, all of that. So on this side, and it resonates, people get it. You start talking about these things, and you're going to lose a C-suite audience. Right? Abundance thinking, visualization, affirmations, letting go, detachment theory, energy alignment, vibration. That's not going to fly when you're talking to executives. Whether they believe it or not, whether they use it or not, and that was me. I was using it, but I didn't talk about it because people get the eye roll. But I was using and testing it. And that's how I built the high performing teams. I was in sales and sales operations during that period, and so I had a great testing ground because I could see inputs and outputs. I can test. I was able to test it, and that's why I guess I developed the confidence that I know that these things work. Very much aligned with Good to Great by Jim Collins, Great by Choice, Jim Collins. Liz Weissman, Multipliers, Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. All those are aligned, and I bring them up because each one of those books are written by researchers. They were written by people who did thousands of interviews and compiled it all. And that's why I use those books when I'm working with leaders, because it cuts out all the noise that people bring up. I'll get into it more, but the purpose of the Dynamic Leadership Center is to do exactly this, is to bring us down from all these possibilities that require assumptions and styles and all that to what actually works consistently on a bad day of a bad week, as well as great days and great weeks. And we have here's the slide together. And so on the bottom, we've got the continuum, practical and behavioral versus the quantum and the metaphysical. And you can fill these words, and I don't want to get into a debate or discussion about is it this word or that word. The point is, we know we have these two continuums, and on one side it's more practical, and on the other side it moves towards mystical. Now I could go like even further over. And by the way, I don't talk much about the spiritual realm because I want to keep it with agency. And as soon as you start introducing the spiritual realm, you now have more assumptions. So yes, I get that, and that's over there, and I believe in it, and it's at play, but it's not in this conversation, because in this conversation, I want something that's science-based and can be proven. Not that the other can't be proven. I think hopefully you get my point, that you're still making assumptions. So things like miracles and divine intervention, that's definitely in play, and I've seen it work. But there's some factors around. I'd love to talk about that in another time, but this, for now, we're going to stay here. So when I change that continuum from this to this, so this is what it looks like today, law of attraction over here, I swap out that side. I collapse all of this part of the continuum that looks like law of attraction type content, and I collapse it, and I can explain it. And that's what one of the things I want to do with this group is to have real conversations and unpack some of this, because everyone has best practices, everyone has their go-to, the things that work. I believe, and it's worked so far for 5 years, I believe I can explain every best practice through the lens of neuroplasticity and epigenetics. Epigenetics, essentially, if you think about having 20,000 different genes, and each of those genes have switches for expression on and off, and so when you look at the permutations, it's massive, but because a lot of it is habitual, we just keep doing the same thing over and over. But when you look at things like spontaneous remission and these healings that can't be explained, a lot of this you can track it back to epigenetics. Epigenetics does have some similarities to neuroplasticity, and it makes sense because it's all coming from the nervous system. But again, for our conversation, we don't really need to get into epigenetics, but I just bring that up because I sometimes will have to rely on that to explain some of these best practices. And the other area that helps is I introduce mirror neurons, which is part of the network of neurons, so it comes under that neuroplasticity, but there's less research done on the network of neurons, but it is how we have empathy with other people, so it does come into play. I believe it's mirror neurons that happen when someone across the country is thinking about you, or you're thinking about them, and you find out you're thinking about each other at the same time, and you do something of these just serendipitous acts where somebody else all of a sudden shows up. You know, I remember one of my mentors always said that when you have the goals, if you have the goals and you're doing the work, the money shows up when you need the money, the people show up when you need the people, the ideas show up when you need the ideas. And so where's that coming from? How's that happen? You could say it's faith, you could say it's God, and I'm not saying it's not, but I'm also saying that mirror neurons can play a role, and they've done enough testing where you can see that connection. On this side, when I talk about allostatic neuroplasticity, there's two parts of it. One is the behavioral, reactive, and identity habits that have to change. When you have a goal, it's something different. It's a breakthrough. And I'm not talking about incremental goals. That's the other thing. If I'm going to work with somebody, we're working on massive goals. I take their goal that they think they should be working on, and we have a 3 to 10x conversation about it, because what I want to do is make sure that the jump is big enough to scare them, because that's where the neuroplasticity comes into play, to get rid of the reactivity, to get rid of some of the identity weaknesses that are there. Incremental goals, I don't have to make these changes. Stretch goals, I do have to make these changes. We talked about that last week. And transformational goals, definitely. This is why transformations don't work, because people don't work on the behavioral, reactive, and identity goals. They do use hacks, but hacks don't work. They're not sustainable, because the homeostasis, remember, 100 billion neurons, trillions of connections, there's so many associations that the homeostasis is always going to win when it comes to hacks. It's just going to overpower the hack. The hack gets absorbed, and then it doesn't work anymore. I believe that's what's at play with supplements. If you look at how gene expression works, and how it's all trying to keep stabilized, and you consider that everything we eat, it goes into this tube, and it stays in that tube until it goes out, right? And then the system pulls the nutrients from that tube. And the nutrients, this is how you can eat different things and still not change, because it's pulling the nutrients that are needed. So there's a lot of HRV and coherence that we can get into conversation, but again, it's beyond the scope of here. But having an awareness of what's going on helps you understand some of the limitations, the resistance factors, the empowerment catalysts that do exist. So these are the behavioral, reactive, and identity habits. You have to do the inner work. If you don't do the inner work, you're going to do what was always done, and you're going to fall back to where you were. This is why major transformations and reinventions in organizations fail. It's not because they're impossible, it's because they're hard, and they're not hard because it's like hard work lifting things. It's hard work because the inner work has to happen. And an organization is made up of people, and those people all have habits, they have comfort zones, etc. That inner work has to occur. It's fractal. It has to occur at the micro level, and it has to occur at the macro level. And because we're always conditioning our environment and responding to the conditioning of our environment, you can see how that comes into play. So that's by working over here and bringing this into the conversation, where we talked about the optimal pressure. This is called the inverted U. If you don't have enough, this is why the goals have to be ambitious. You get disengagement, lack motivation, low effort. If the goals are too much, they're not realistic, you end up over here, and you're heading to collapse, the struggling to process, cognitive narrowing, the stress, and things don't work. And once you narrow down, you have less access to your best thinking, which gets into the knowing-doing gap. So we want to manage this so that we're in the optimal pressure zone up here, peak effectiveness, Goldilocks zone, flow state, however you want to call it. It's not too much and not too little. And you can manage this yourself, and certainly for leaders, we want leaders to manage this. And the way you manage it is not with corrective action. You manage it, that's why I call it dynamic leadership, by picking up the cues. You'll see it when it starts getting here, and you can still pull it back. And this is where we talk in dynamic leadership. This is what I'm doing. I'm helping the leader use the cues that are coming in. Think of it like thin slicing. Think of it like sensory acuity, so that they are able to keep the team here, but also the leader has to be able to keep themselves here. They have to be able to stay in this area as well. So not only using sensory acuity to watch the people who we're interacting with, we're using interoception to manage ourselves as well. So think of it like sensory acuity, applying it to ourselves. So we're picking up those sensations at the very earliest point, because before you have a response and a reaction, there's something that you feel. And that feeling is connected to associations, neurons that fire together, wire together. That feeling triggers a meaning, and that's a path of least resistance because it's a well-myelinated habit. That path of least resistance then fires the next set, and this is happening all inside that first half second. It fires the next set, and the next set, and the next set, and next thing you know, you're spiraling or on the way to a spiral. And the way to deal with that is very, very early on. And that's when I talk about the high impact, low effort in the network of neurons side, and the high effort, low impact on the conscious mind side. Once it gets passed from the network of neurons side over to the conscious awareness, the effort goes up, because we're talking about 11 million bits per second processing speed over here versus 50 bits per second processing speed over here. So the leverage is massive, 200,000 times faster, and potentially more content being processed over here. So the meaning is set. All that happens very early on. This is where cognitive biases happen. This is where meaning gets assigned. This is where it looks at the path of least resistance. And then it forms a reaction. And that reaction is handed off to the conscious mind and turned into something the conscious mind can perceive. And then you have your response, which is happening over here. This is where we work with allostatic neuroplasticity. This is my zone right here. So we don't need new tools and techniques and practices. The same stuff works. It's breathing, the modulation, it's affirmations, it's good rest, it's hydration. All the things work. But what we're doing is applying it here so that we can see the high impact, low effort benefits that come from dealing with it early. So that's the pressure curve, the two sides, side A, side B, I call it, and then the 600 millisecond or the 1 second model. And keep in mind, on average, this is happening tens of thousands of times a day. And when you are spending more time in alpha state, naturally you're going to have fewer of these. When you're spending more time in beta state, you're going to have more of these. But the other thing I'll point out is that when people are being triggered, what happens is they begin reacting to their own reactions, meaning there may have been a stimulus, and think about yourself, right? You get an email that's bad news, means you're going to have to do extra work, everything you did is gone to waste, whatever. Your computer crashes, you lose everything, you get that sensation, and next thing, but you can stop that. The rest of those, in that example, the rest of those interaction or reactions are reacting to your own reaction. And that's what we want to stop. The system that we're dealing with, remember, 300,000 years of evolution, most of it was hunter-gatherer. The system that we're dealing with treats threats as Serengeti tigers. And that Serengeti tiger requires instantaneous action. You don't have time to think and make a choice. But now it's applying it to an email, or it's applying it to the fact that your software crashed. And yeah, you got to deal with it as something to address, but reacting to your own reactions and spiraling out and catastrophizing is not going to help you. We want to interrupt that and get back to a place where we are have a high state of coherence and restore our HRV. And in dynamic leadership, what I talk about is how do you get there how do you fix it before it even happens? So we're using preemptive priming over here, because there is a pre-stimulus phase. We're using preemptive priming. We're using dynamic interception. So we're intercepting those things with conditioning. We're intercepting it so before the meaning is assigned. Because remember, when the stimulus comes in, the network of neurons is cycling through, figuring, what does this mean? What does this mean? And it's possible to intercept it by conditioning in a step right here. And then after that, if it gets past that, you now have your dynamic modulation. So we're fixing it on the way. We're like changing the wheels while the car is running down the road, changing the tires while it's running down the road. And then the last phase is dynamic regulation. And the difference is that dynamic modulation, we're doing it real time, just like dynamic suspension is reacting instantly to bumps in the road, the amount of pressure, and it's adjusting the damping and compression and or the rebound, the bound and rebound dampening, and it's adjusting it real time to make the road feel smooth. And same with dynamic traction control. It's literally using a feedback mechanism to read how much the tire is starting to slip, because it picks it up as soon as the rubber begins tearing. It's picking that up, and it's obviously all programmed. So they call it they say it makes 10,000 decisions a second. The point is, it's just continuous. But that's what we're doing in here. That's why I use the word dynamic. It's dynamic because we're modulating it real time. We're moving back and forth. And by the way, I like to point out in neuroscience, it's never this clean. It's layers, it's feedback, it's these things working together. But that's very difficult to understand, and it's not actionable. Using it this way, it's actionable. And then this third phase is dynamic regulation. So modulation is in the process. Regulation is adjusting. So this is, you could think of this almost as the driver getting involved, maybe moving from some bumps or maybe slowing down a little bit. There's some dynamic regulation here. But if you get past there, now you're on the conscious mind side, and we've lost the leverage of the hyperspeed of the network of neurons. So that's the 1 second model. And the reason I call it 600 milliseconds is because it's a half second, and these are all, again, averages, because you can have this collapse down to 1/10 of a second, and it can expand. But the averages, and this is why it's so difficult to describe it from a neuroscience, because there's so many caveats and if this, then that, and it's just very, very difficult to be actionable. But for lay people, we don't operate at 11 million bits per second. We barely operate at the 50 bits per second. So we don't need all of that science speak to act on it. Just like you don't have to understand everything about a car to turn the ignition and drive. That's the level that we're talking about here. And then the last one, the last slide, and I'll wrap it up with this. So this is why step one, we have to have an understanding of how the beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, physiology work together, because each of these can impact the other one. Every one impacts the other, and when you get it working right, you get the allostatic capacity. The reason I do the circle is because we have to do laps. So when I first start working with somebody, first thing I have to do is remove the resistance factors that are based on reactivity, because that it's just like if you're trying to talk to a person who has a phobia and talking to them about the object of the phobia, snakes, it triggers them into a phobia. So we first have to break those linkages, and we do that with the process. But once you get it working, now you have the allostatic capacity. And remember, allostatic or allostasis is the stability of an upward trajectory, whereas homeostasis is stability of a status quo trajectory. And then from there we go into the state coherence, and this is where I talk about the HRV. So in that other slide, I said HRV because HRV, heart rate variability, it's not whether or not your heart is beating fast or slow. It's the gaps in between the heartbeat. So this is not going to be said scientifically, but if you consider that a person who's stressed out, their heart is beating as fast as it can beat, so there's no variability. Every space between the beat is the same. And if you're in a meditative state and real relaxed, you have the capacity for those gaps between the beats to flex, and that's where you get the variability. So the more heart rate variability you have, and it's not exact science, but the higher your coherence. And we know from studies that low heart rate variability correlates with low willpower. And if you have higher heart rate variability, you have more willpower. And that's why it's connected. And heart rate variability is a good way to measure it. We have watches now that will tell you your heart rate variability, so you can look at that. But what we want to do here is have high coherence, and I get this from Dan Siegel, low chaos and low rigidity. The more coherence shrinks, the more chaos and the more rigidity you can have. The more coherence expands, the less of those two you have. And then here's what I was describing before with the 1 second model and the readiness. This is where the cognitive biases come into play, the path of least resistance. If a person's having a phobia response, that gets triggered here, and then it just bam, 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 right? Because it's reacting to reacting to reacting. You never get to this side because it's such life and death. It becomes such a life and death moment that the reaction is just going crazy, which is why a person who's triggered becomes irrational. They're no longer talking to you. They're no longer talking about what's going on externally. They're now reacting to their own reactions. When you understand that, and if you've been coaching any length of time, you already know that once a person goes into that reaction to reaction zone, you just back off, change the subject, and work on something else. But now you have some words that go with it. And it's also sometimes when you're interacting with somebody online, you can spot when they go, even though you're not interacting with them, you can spot when they go into that zone of reacting to reactions. And And at that point, I just back out because it doesn't make sense. Now, I'll have to pick up the conversation the next day. If I'm in a coaching conversation, for the most part, I just change the subject because there's other things. I've already done the calibration. And by the way, I'll throw that in there. When you do your onboarding conversations and your initial learning who they are, I think there's that's a real good opportunity to calibrate how they look when they're calm, how they look when they're in a good coherent state, because that is going to give you the information you need, because you don't have gauges on them, right? But it gives you the information you need for the sensory acuity to say, oops, we're slipping. And then you come back and you literally modulate the process real time. So not only can you modulate it real time for yourself, dynamic modulation, you can dynamically modulate it for other people as well. And that's the idea. And then we have the response, emotional modulation, and then action and return to mindfulness. This is happening thousands of times a day. So by fixing these, we are removing all that assumption work, all that assumption content that comes out of law of attraction adjacent kind of rhetoric. Because we're changing the inner work. We're doing the inner work, so our habits change, behavioral, reactive, and identity. And of course, reactive and identity, the hardest, because the reactive ones are responding to stuff you don't know, and a lot of it's old hurts, painful hurts, and the identity is more the elements. Identity is a construct of all the elements, the reactivity, the behavior. So this is why identity is so hard to change, but with neuroplasticity you can. And then the neural conditioning is you're conditioning in so that you're able to stay in a coherent state. We're using the synaptogenesis to make the desired path the path of least resistance, and we're using myelination to have the sustainability. And that's what's going on with the 1 second model. And by doing that enough, you end up with better minutes, better hours, better days, better weeks. And when I say better, more aligned with your goal. Remember, success, the progressive realization of predetermined, worthwhile personal goals. So that's it. I am going to leave this up for a while and then love to have some discussions around it, because I think there's enough in here that we can have a good round table. So let me know your thoughts. I'd love to see your comments, and I'll respond to them in next week's live. I'll probably also go live on Friday or Monday, just with the short things. I want to bring something else into play. I did a post today about neuroplasticity, and I was using an infographic from another LinkedIn member, and I want to talk about that a little bit. All right, there you go.